On October 1st, 1903, Nuff said McGreevy and his Royal Rooters were among the first to pass through the turnstiles to see the Boston Pilgrims take on the Pittsburgh Pirates in the very first championship series between the two leagues. It would be a best-of-9 game contest. Realizing that this was a golden opportunity to prove the superiority of his new league, Van Johnson ordered the Boston owner to beat Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh had been favored to win, but Boston was aided by a series of disasters that undercut the Pirates. One pitcher had been injured. Their star shortstop, Honus Wagner, was playing hurt. And just as the series got underway, Ed Doheny, another pitcher, suffered a mental breakdown and was sent to an asylum.
That was probably the wildest series ever played. Arguing all the time between the teams, between the players and the umpires, and especially between the players and the fans. That's the truth. The fans were part of the game in those days. They'd pour right out onto the field and argue with the players and the umpires. It was sort of hard to keep the game going sometimes, to say the least. Tommy Leach.
The Pirates took an early 3-1 lead in the series, thanks to Deacon Philippe, who pitched and won every one of Pittsburgh's 3 victories, beating the great Cy Young twice. But spurred on by the zeal of Nuff said McGreevy and his Royal Rooters, Boston roared back, winning the next 3 games.
I think those Boston fans actually won that series for the Pilgrims. We beat them 3 out of the first 4 games, and then they'd start singing that damn Tessie song. You could hardly play ball. They were singing Tessie so damn loud. Only instead of singing Tessie, I love you madly, they'd sing special lyrics. Like when Honus Wagner came to bat, they'd sing, Honus, why do you hit so badly? Sort of got on your nerves after a while. And before we knew what had happened, we'd lost the series. Tommy Leach.
In the 8th and final game, Boston shut out Pittsburgh 3-0.
By defeating the National League champions from Pittsburgh at the Huntington Avenue grounds yesterday, the Boston Americans made it 5 victories out of 8 games played, which gives them a clear title to the highest honor ever achieved in baseball. Boston Globe.
The games proved so popular that the 2 leagues decided to hold a championship series every year. Boston manager Jimmy Collins raised the very first championship flag over the Huntington Avenue grounds. A team from Boston had beaten a team from Pittsburgh just 650 miles away, but the owners insisted on calling it the World Series.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, friends. Welcome. Welcome to our little showgram here. We call it Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate you finding us across the vast landscape of podcast land and putting us in your earbuds. We greatly appreciate it, and hopefully we'll keep you entertained for a little while and hopefully induce you to come back. Today we're in baseball land, and old-timey baseball at that. But as you know, we don't necessarily revel per se in the old black and white world of baseball from the early days, just for its own sake. As we've talked about many times, and as we allude in this conversation, a lot of themes that keep coming back over and over again and aren't necessarily new things that have popped up in today's modern day landscape of sports. They're actually issues that are very human and very common, very long-lived, and they keep coming back around and around again. And that's what history is all about, and that's partially why we kind of do some of these conversations, and we sort of stumble into these understandings. And in baseball, there's no shortage of stories. And here's an interesting story that kind of came across my radar. I want to say by accident, but this book came in the mail a couple of weeks back from our friends at St. Johann Press. And it's about the Deadball era of baseball, something we've explored in a couple of episodes previously. But in particular, this is a work written by and overseen and edited by our guest today, Steve Steinberg, about the World Series during that Deadball era. And that we're specifically talking about the years roughly 1903 through 1919. And we've talked about the Deadball era. This is literally the ball was not nearly as lively as it is today, and where hits and runs were more, shall we say, manufactured, and the art of pitching and the art of bunting and singles and running and sliding and some of those other sort of key elements of the sport of baseball really became honed. But what's fascinating in this book and in this conversation with Steve Steinberg is the writing and the photography that helped build this book. You have to remember, in this era, 1903 to 1919, you kids today, you young whippersnappers, you didn't know there was no radio, right? There was no television, of course, right? There was just simply the written word. And as we allude in our conversation, in newspapers, for example, in New York, you had at least a dozen, if not more, daily newspapers, right? That was the way people understood what was going on around them. And sports, of course, baseball in particular, probably being the ultimate sport, the biggest sport, certainly in the New York metropolitan area, but also in the country as well. And some legendary writers who were, essentially putting the dreamscapes together, shall we say, about the stories around baseball, right? So perhaps a little factually embellished, but I mean, you're talking about like folks like Ring Lardner and Grantland Rice and Damon Runyon, and I mean some of the greatest writers of that era who began or continued to be sports writers, quote unquote, during that time. And their writing is featured in this book as we go year by year into these various teams playing the World Series during this Deadball era, and also the photography. And you're going to find out through our conversation with Steve some very interesting photos in here that literally and figuratively speak 1,000 words. These are very rare photos, some of them never published before. And again, if you're growing up, if you're living during this era and you're trying to understand what baseball was all about and the World Series in particular, these photos and the writings that surrounded them from the various newspapers covering these games are just an amazing tableau and watercolor paintings almost of what was going on. And unfortunately, the colors are not there, right? Because it's all black and white. But the stories and the imagery are certainly there. And this is our conversation with Steve Steinberg, the author, the editor of the World Series in the Deadball Era. It is published by St. Johann Press, and we get into it with some teams that since moved on, right? But that's exactly why we focus on this little show. The Boston Americans, now, of course, the part of the Boston Red Sox, and the Philadelphia Athletics, which peripatetically are now in Oakland as the A's, and we'll see how long they stay in Oakland, but they have been around for a long time. They feature very significantly during this era, as do the New York Giants, the New York baseball Giants, who, of course, broke the hearts of many New Yorkers by moving to San Francisco in 1957-58. But the New York Giants and the Philadelphia Athletics, very dominant teams during the World Series era of the Deadball years. We also get into a little bit of the Boston Braves, who are now, of course, firmly ensconced in Atlanta, or suburban Atlanta, shall we say. And yes, the Brooklyn Dodgers of that era do make an appearance. Of course, now part of we're now the LA Dodgers, but we do tip our cap to the Brooklyn Dodgers, who were part of the 1916 World Series as well. So all that and more coming up with our guest, Steve Steinberg, in a couple of seconds. So stay tuned. Some promotional stuff. Let's get that out of the way and get right to the meaty, juicy, conversational tidbits, shall we? SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. That's the place to go for all your favorite sports memorabilia. I'm frankly not too sure how much of the Deadball era stuff you're going to find there. But look, if you're into baseball, if you're in any sport, sports for that matter, professionally or otherwise, SportsHistoryCollectibles.com is the place to go. And you're going to get 15% off any of your purchases when you go not only to the site, but you got to use the promo code, of course, and that's Good Seats. Good Seats, either one word or two words, doesn't matter. 15% off all of your purchases will be yours at sportshistorycollectibles.com when you enter that promo code. And visit there early, visit there often. Proprietor Dean Mitchell is always putting brand new stuff up there, brand new, old, new stuff. You know what I mean? And the photography that he does is quite painstaking, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it, even if you're just visiting and window shopping. But when you do find something, of course, please use the promo code GOODSEATS for your 15% discount at checkout. Again, sportshistorycollectibles.com. And we thank them tremendously for their sponsorship, and we hope you enjoy their site as much as we do. And of course, audiobooks, we keep telling you, audiobooks are amazing. They're great. They're a great way to fill in time when you're not listening to your favorite podcast. Singular, of course. Wink, wink, nod, nod. And the best place by far on the planet to get and enjoy audiobooks, of course, it's Audible. And the place to go to get your free trial, your free 1-month subscription to the service, and a free audiobook download to give it a try for yourself. Say it with me, nice and loud, from the rooftops, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you're going to get a free audiobook download and a free 1-month trial of the Audible service. A reminder, you can cancel at any time. It's basically a no-risk proposition, and we appreciate you giving them a try, as they will, of course, too. And how many books are there to choose from? Over 180,000 titles. Think about that just for 1 second. 180,000 titles. I mean, you can't even name those titles like within a month without repeating one. And that means you're going to be able to find at least one. Come on, one book that you can use for your free trial, please. I mean, if you can't find one there, well, maybe reading and listening to books isn't your thing, but it should be. And there's only one way to find out. And that's to go to audibletrial.com/goodseats to get your free audiobook download. Do it now and enjoy it. And, you can thank me later. And send me a note and tell me how much you enjoyed the process and listening to an audiobook. And hopefully you'll find something from the world of sports history. There's tons of great titles in that category. So go for it. Thanks for trying it out. We appreciate it. All right. So let's not waste any more time. Let us get to our fun conversation with Steve Steinberg. He, the author, the editor of the World Series in the Deadball Era. Here is our chat. I was very interested in your story on your website, and maybe we could start there. I'm really interested to hear your personal journey, your story into becoming, perhaps maybe as a second career, a baseball historian. But that's not what your original career was, and I think our audience would benefit from hearing your personal story as to how you came into now being an authoritative figure in your own right in various nooks and crannies of baseball history.
Yeah, until most of my career I've been in retail and retail management, and have had a chain of retail clothing stores that were large stores in smaller towns. And it ended up selling those in the very late 1990s. And around 98, when my younger son was only 10 years old, we basically would frequent card shows, as a lot of kids like to do, baseball card shows, and go to card shops. And I had been with him in one card shop and just noticed there was a box of baseball cards. And the first one that was facing out on the counter said Urban Shocker. And I just thought it had to do with a shooting at some ballpark or something with a name like Urban Shocker. I'd never heard of that name as a ball player. And that's really when I got hooked, when I found out that that was the name of a guy, that the pitcher had gone 18-6 for the 27 Yankees. And then when I flipped on the back and realized that he was dead, a year later, it really hooked me. And the Shocker story is really what got me going. And although, ironically, I did not publish that until almost 20 years later. And at the Sabre National Convention this past Saturday, I received the award for the Sabre Baseball Research Award for this year for the Shocker book that came out last year.
That's great. So for our audience who isn't necessarily as deep in the weeds in baseball history, you want to describe what Sabre is and how potentially life-changing it was for you and is for a number of folks who
Right. SABR stands for the Society for American Baseball Research, and it's been around since the early 70s. There are still 2 founding members that were alive. It was a bunch of people that just happened to have been in Cooperstown, one afternoon, and they said, hey, let's get together and start this. And SABR is mostly associated with the sabermetrics, which and Bill James is really the man that started that, and that is looking at the numbers a different way, looking at baseball numbers in a much more sophisticated way. And even those of us, and I'm one of them, that are not really into baseball numbers can understand, for example, that if you have a ballpark in Coors Field, the ball's going to do different things than it will at sea level, or that if you have a small ballpark, a batting average might mean something different than in a huge cavernous place, let's say like Chavez Ravine. So sabermetrics began to look at the numbers, began to look at things, really emphasize things like on-base percentage and certainly slugging average. Batting average really is something that, if you think about it, 2 people can have a 300 batting average, and one of them can hit nothing but singles, and the other one can have a mix of extra base hits, and obviously the latter is more valuable. And even looking at things like, and it's gotten more sophisticated than that. But SABR as an organization, even though it's associated with the statistical end of it, has many members that are really not into the numbers end of it. And I would count myself as one of them, that I'm not really a numbers cruncher, even though I can certainly relate to a lot of those things. Some people are into the history of ballparks or Negro League ball, or specific teams or records. So SABR has a number of committees. It's a wonderful organization. And, for example, one of the amazing things that SABR started around the time that I joined was what they call their Bio Project Committee. And Mark Armoire, who's now on the SABR board, he's a member of our Northwest chapter, decided to undertake a goal of having a biography written on every man or person that's ever played baseball, and there's now about 18,000 of them. Of course, 19,000. Some of them are active, and it seemed like a wildly aggressive, chaotic, almost march. But SABR now has probably 4,000 bios of players, and the neat thing is, SABR made the decision some years ago not to limit access to those biographies to members. But if you just do a Google search, almost invariably, you'll get a baseball reference for a specific person. Baseball reference will come up, which will show the stats for the person. And usually the SABR bio, if indeed that person has a bio, and more of them do, it's going to be one of the probably no further down the page than the 3rd, possibly the 4th one. So it really enriches it. And in my case, I'm really interested in the people and the stories of people that have been forgotten or overlooked, that have maybe fallen through the cracks of history. That someone like Shocker was a star, and every 10-year-old kid knew who he was in the 1920s. But now he's been, had been virtually forgotten until hopefully my book had a part in making his amazing story. Here's somebody that was dying while he was a star on the 1927 Yankees, and knew that he was dying of heart disease. So there's a lot of different angles and aspects to SABR, and the members are really probably, the biggest receptacle of knowledge of the organization.
So give me a sense of the, you mentioned obviously the one from the book, and congratulations on your award, of course. How do you, what piques your interest? Like, what are the stories that jump out and interest you? I mean, obviously we focus on this little silly podcast on teams and leagues defunct and or relocated and otherwise across all sports. There's a treasure trove of lots of forgotten nooks and crannies there, and the stories that we've unearthed over the last year plus, and there's just tons more to come. And frankly, new leagues and teams being made all the time, right? So it's almost like I think it'll be sort of an endless loop of stories. But I'm just curious as to what sort of particular genre or finely granulated paths are particularly interested. Like, what first of all, in terms of the time period that I'm very much hooked on, the Deadball Era, which goes from 1901 to 1920, especially the second decade of the 20s, and the 1920s really interests me. And it's just a time period that
Even though a century has passed, the game in many ways has not changed that much. I think that somebody that came back from the late teens and went to a ball game today could probably relate to it. Obviously, there's some differences and changes. And I'm very much into baseball photographs, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And I've always found that the photos from the early 20th century, and I've networked and gotten to know very well some of the largest private collectors in the country, as well as public collections that are out there. And the pictures are very evocative, and the writing was very evocative. And I'm really just when I find out or hear something about players. So to me, it's the stories on these people that really deserve not to be forgotten. And I think they're still out there somewhere in the firmament. But I sometimes say that there's an awful lot of stars out there, even on a very dark night. But not all of them can be seen all the time. So some of these people from the 20s and the teens, their star has been eclipsed by other stars that have come along since then, and their stories are really worth telling. There's a strong human interest angle to it.
Well, before we get into sort of the sort of definition of what the Deadball Era is, because I think that'll be helpful to our audience as well. We've touched on it a couple times.
The early 20s, modern baseball is considered starting in 1901, and that's when the American League was founded. And there was only one league before that, the National. And the American League basically was an upstart, and the National League went to war against it. They finally merged in 1903 because for those first 2 years, players were getting very large and high salaries as one league would steal players from the other and then back again. And it was an era when the ball was not real tightly wound, where players choked up on the bat, and probably the typical score would be a 2-1 game. And pitchers were really dominant in that era. Of course, baseball is a time of going back and forth, and one way of looking at the history of the game is sort of this ongoing struggle between the pitcher and the hitter. And whether it's a pitcher's year like 1968 and then there's a correction, that's really what the game is all about, the battle between pitchers and hitters, and fielders are in there also. Even now, for example, with the shift, I wonder when more and more players are going to start learning how to bunt, and when there's a shift to the right side, they just bunt down the left line. And by the way, down the third baseline, Babe Ruth used to do it when there was actually, in his era, there would be a shift occasionally, and he would be laughing so hard as he ran down first base as he just taps the ball down to the left side of the field. So coming around 1920 is the beginning of what's called a lively ball era, in part because that's when Ruth arrived in New York, and he had been a pitcher, and he started hitting and swinging from the end of the bat. And after World War I, balls were really improved in terms of the wool that was used in the inside of the ball, which during the war had been gone for war purposes. So batting averages rose, and one of the key things that happened before the 20 season is that freak pitches, which would include things like the emery ball, which is when players would doctor a ball with sandpaper, or the mud ball, the paraffin ball, and even the spitball were banned. And that really gave the hitters much more of a comfort zone and much more predictable paths of the ball. It did turn out that the spitball pitchers that were playing before 1920 were finally grandfathered in, and they were allowed to keep the spitball for the rest of their careers, Burley Grimes being the last one, I think 1934. And probably, as we know through baseball history, there have probably been different illegal pitches thrown right up until nowadays. But that was a big moment in 1920, and batting averages started to rise, extra base hit, home runs started to rise also.
Well, I'm not a baseball historian, right? I play one on TV, right? But it would seem to me, as from an outsider's perspective, and not sort of granularly in the weeds or a SABR member for that matter, what is it of that Deadball era? Because it seems, by comparison to the later years, kind of uneventful and a little taut, and not a lot of excitement and all that. But clearly, there's a lot of elemental baseball history in those 2 decades. What is it about that era that's intriguing to you?
Well, I suppose if you're more of a purist, perhaps like I am, a 2-1 game can have as much, if not more, excitement than a 14-1 game, 14-10 game that the Mariners played in Fenway Park on Saturday night. And some of the biggest names of the game, some of the all-time greats, played in that era, and certainly Ty Cobb, while he did go into the 1920s, did. But it's an early era, and there has been enough captured in terms of photographs that we can relate to it. 19th century baseball, and by the way, SABR has a very active 19th century committee, which is people that are really just interested in baseball, before the turn of the 20th century. But it really was an era where, the game was, in many ways quite similar to the modern game. I mean, when the American League and the National League joined forces, that's when foul balls started counting as strikes, other than the third, you can't strike out on a foul ball if it's not caught. But it just goes back to an earlier time, and it's just something from baseball history, and we always hear about from fathers to sons. Of course, now we're also hearing about daughters, but it is just something that is passed along and bonds, generations. And I think unlike, football and basketball, just don't have that rich history. And so often you're at a baseball game or even watching one on TV, and they say, well, that tied the record of Tris Speaker in 1919. I mean, you can't relate to that early history in the NFL or the NBA. It's just not there.
Yeah. So let's get into. I think what I'm hearing from you too is that this is also an era that preceded the vast bulk of electronic media. Right. We're talking about things that were recounted very much in the written form, and in the early days of, or not so early days, but certainly early enough of photography, where proverbially a picture may be worth 1,000 words. And I got to think that there's a lot, I don't know if it's editorial license, but it almost feels like it's almost a more fluid and inviting opportunity for somebody who looks at it through a historical and or editorial lens to think about maybe what's going on without sort of the benefit of having every single shot and play and story sort of, overwritten and or socially media shared, right? There's a gap.
Right. Well, radio didn't really even come up until the 1920s. The first baseball game, and it obviously had a very small audience, was actually in Pittsburgh in 1920. So before 1920, the fans really depended on newspaper accounts. And, I've talked about photographs here with you for a few minutes, but the newspaper accounts were so different because the newspaper writers, the sports writers and the sports columnists really had to paint a picture. And they really, the writing was much more rich, evocative, descriptive, and really had to conjure that up. And so the imagination could fill some things in. I mean, during big games, and this started before the turn of the 20th century, well into until radio really took over, thousands and thousands of fans would congregate around newspaper offices for big ball games, and those newspaper offices would have huge scoreboards where they would track through telegram or later on through wire what was going on in a big game. And there would be this big player board. As we got into the 20th century, they actually had little light bulbs on them, so you would watch the progress of a game on it, and because you couldn't follow it on radio. If it was a big game, your team was in the pennant race. Even if it was a home game, not everybody could be at that home game. And, of course, millions of people in the country. I mean, St. Louis was the westernmost town. Of course, that remained the case up until the 50s. And many people had never gone to, a major league ball game. Perhaps that's why many players after seasons would go on tours, which were called barnstorming tours, where you actually could be living in Denver and you could actually see Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig because they would come on through and play an exhibition game against a local team, or sometimes Ruth would head up one team and Gehrig would head up the other.
How much license do you think? And we'll get into some of the specifics. Obviously, the book we're going to circle around in a couple of minutes here is about some of the more dramatic World Series of this Deadball era. But before we sort of get into that, I'm wondering, in your research, the writers that you're talking about and the photography that you're accessing as you go back in time, The writing in particular, how accurate do you think, based on all of your readings, was that writing, or how much, shall we say, creative license was taken, do you think, and maybe embellished, or is there really no way to know?
Well, I think, what happened on the field is we don't have, obviously, film, and repeatedly, certainly they were on a bigger stage in the World Series. There'd be close plays and controversial plays. Was he safe at first base? Was that a pass ball or a wild pitch, or was that a foul ball or a hit batsman? We don't know. I think most of the facts, are usually gotten fairly right. But the writers of that era, and many of them were young, and even the sports editors were guys that started in their 20s, really embellished the game and embellished the players. They built up heroes back then. And one of my favorite quotes came from a well-known book by Frederick Lewis Allen, only yesterday, where he looked back at the first 25 years of the 20th century, and he tells the story there that when World War I ended, a little boy turned to his dad and said, "Dad, what are they going to put in the newspaper now?" Because the newspaper was full of pages of the Battle of the Somme or wherever in Europe. And what basically happened is sport pages really exploded, and baseball celebrity rose, and ball players were basically made to be larger than life. And I think the sports writers had a lot to do with that. Nowadays, obviously, there's a lot more critical coverage, and the sports writers realize that the more they make Babe Ruth heroic, the more newspapers they're going to sell. The more papers they sell, maybe the more money they get. And the writers started coming into their own. Until the war, very often, there was not a byline with the name of a writer. But once the writers, things expanded, and of course that was the celebrity in all sports, whether it was Jack Tilden in tennis, or Bobby Jones in golf, or Jack Dempsey in boxing, Red Grange in football. That really was after the war, and of course people wanted, some respite from all that terrible war news, and those writers had a big hand in that. There was not a lot of controversy that was explored. It was making these men heroes, and we have to remember that at that time, baseball really owned the country in terms from a sports standpoint. The basketball, football were really very minor things. Boxing was quite big, but that, really didn't happen that often, and kids really didn't get into it that much. Horse racing was even back then very big, but again, that was, a limited appeal and just specific times. Baseball really was what dominated American culture.
Yeah, in that writing, though, would you call it, would it rise to the level of, for lack of a better word, complicity? Right. I mean, where is the journalistic eye sort of sharpened there? It doesn't sound like it. It sounds like it's more background and story and embellishment to make things more interesting and heroic, perhaps, than they may be.
Yeah, I mean, complicity has sort of a little bit of a negative tinge to it, but there's no question. I mean, the sports writers, one even today could say, well, the sports pages, if you follow a team, it's almost like free advertising for the team when it's covered. But I think there was a partnership, and it was obviously the last World Series of the Deadball Era, which was the Black Sox scandal, when 8 members of the Chicago White Sox, who were heavily favored, basically got connected with gamblers and not only didn't do their best, but helped the White Sox lose to Cincinnati. That was a very difficult, event, and it was covered up quite efficiently, and it was almost only by accident that a year later that the Black Sox scandal got exposed, and baseball's governing body changed to a new commissioner system. So, dirt wasn't going to be, if there was some, wasn't going to be publicized, and it was romanticized, and they helped romanticize the game.
And for the benefit of our audience, can you give us some of the names, frankly, of some of these writers? Because some of them go beyond just being sports writers at the time, right? They sort of went on to be writers of some.
Right. Well, some of them, and certainly in our Deadball World Series books, were people like Ring Lardner, Damon Runyon, who went on to write a lot of plays. And Damon Runyon was a big New York sports writer in the teens for one of the Hearst newspapers. And Haywood Broun, some of us older listeners might remember from Wide World of Sports, there was a gentleman called Haywood Halebrun who used to wear these funny, colorful jackets. That was Haywood Broon's son, and those were some of the more famous ones. And some of the writers were more known to to baseball fans, like Tim Murnane, in Chicago. But a lot of the writers were really terrific writers, even though they weren't as well known. And again, until in 1920, and you'll see that many newspaper articles did not have the name of the person there, so we don't even know who really wrote some of the articles. We just know it's the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it may say on top, special to the Inquirer. And so we don't know. And certainly even more anonymous than the writers were the photographers, who are virtually unknown from that era. They didn't. There would never be a credit next to it. But as some of these people, like Haywood Broon, there were well-known writers like Sid Mercer in New York, Sam Crane in New York, and Crane actually played Major League Baseball in the 1880s. These guys got big followers, and every now and then, one newspaper would raid a big name from another newspaper and pay a higher salary, and somebody that was yesterday in one paper, all of a sudden today is in a different newspaper.
Well, that's interesting. And it's also a good sort of segue, I think, into the actual book. And we're talking about it's called the World Series in the Deadball Era. And maybe you can give our audience, before we sort of get into some of the years and the teams and stuff. And obviously, as you know, we love the teams, in this case, in the incarnations that they used to be, right? Not necessarily their current incarnations. Again, for whatever reasons we pursue these things. Sure. Give our audience a sense of sort of the tonality and the format of how this book is laid out, because you do rely very heavily on newspaper accounts. We decided, or basically in getting involved with the book, I decided there are so many books that have written about the World Series. I probably have in my library about 20 of them. So the last thing I really think that a baseball library needs is another book, telling what happened in this series or that series. But there were two things: wanting to showcase the sports writers of the time, and not necessarily trying to get every play or even every key play, but letting the reader go back and get a sense of what it was like, and basically just taking the newspaper columns from the day, and the only thing as editors that we've added is, for each game in a series, we'll have a comment at the beginning. Christy Mathewson was the Giants played the Athletics, and Christy Mathewson was the winning pitcher, and some Eddie Plank or whoever it might be was the losing pitcher, and let it go at that, and let the sports writers of the time tell the story. At the same time, the book marries that unique commentary with some very, very rare photos, and many of them have not been seen for a century. Many of them may have last been published when they were published the first time, during a World Series, drawing on collections. Again, some may be publicly accessible. Many of them are in the hands of private collectors, and so it's really letting the sports writers and the photographers tell the story. At one time, and it didn't make it at the end, but a working title that I had for the book was from the lenses, or from the pens and lenses of those who were there, because the book's really being told by the newspaper writers and the photographers who were there. Yeah, and just to give our audience a bit of a sense here, and I actually will use this maybe as a pivot into a couple of the teams, because obviously the Athletics and the Giants of that era were very commonly found in these various World Series, and we'll get to them in a second. But sure. I'm just going to read this, and not to bore the audience, but it's hardly boring because I think it's tremendous writing. So in your 1911 chapter, co-written with Norman Macht, the Philadelphia Athletics and the New York Giants, here's a great quote from the New York Sun. Now, it's unattributed, of course, like you said before, but great scene setting. New York is throbbing with baseball expectancy. All day yesterday, baseball notables and baseball commenters poured into the city. And what with home and out-of-town fans, New York last night harbored more national game enthusiasts than ever before congregated for a baseball event. Interest in the World Series between the Giants and the Athletics, which begins today at the Polo Grounds, lively for a week, grew feverish yesterday. The unwanted animation around the hotels where baseball folk make their headquarters attracted the interest of those not ordinarily keen for baseball. There be some such benighted persons. And the subject of the big diamond battles put everything else in the background. Now, how's that for scene setting, right? I mean, that's like a watercolor painting, not a description of events.
Right, and that was a World Series between two great teams, which are not around anymore, relocated, but the New York Giants and the Philadelphia Athletics. And it also happens that 1911 is probably, if you had to pick one pitcher and one hitter from the Deadball Era who was really sort of would emerge as a star, you would pick somebody that was fortunate enough to be on a team that was there repeatedly. And Christy Mathewson would be the pitcher, and Frank Home Run Baker would be the hitter. And Home Run Baker got his reputation, although he didn't actually technically get his nickname, but for a couple very dramatic home runs that were hit, in that World Series. And Hugh Fullerton is another writer that I should mention, who was out of Chicago, who actually played a role in uncovering the Black Sox scandal. But he was very big in covering, and he had a following, and he would have his own bylines, going back to certainly when the Chicago Cubs and the White Sox played in 2006.
So what was it? So what was it about the Giants and the A's that made them so dominant during this era? I mean, I'm sure there are a number of factors, but what comes to mind as sort of being maybe some of the...
one of the things that does come to mind in contrasting them with, for example, the St. Louis Browns, and I've been a member of the St. Louis Browns Historical Society for many, many years, going back to the beginning of this century, is they had really good players, but they also had really good management. And back in those eras, there really weren't, the business manager was not really like today's general manager. The business manager would be the man who checked the train schedule, booked the hotels, and did a lot of that stuff. But in most cases, it was the manager who sort of was a director of player personnel, general manager, everything all rolled up to one, in one. And in the case of these two teams, if you go back over the course of baseball history, I think even now somebody would have to say that John McGraw of the Giants and Connie Mack of the Athletics would still rank among certainly the top 10 and probably even the top 5 managers of all time. And between the two of them, they managed for about 80 years. I mean, Connie Mack had obviously some declining teams in Philadelphia after the 31 World Series. But these men were very sharp and very shrewd. What makes it more interesting is that they were virtually opposites from a personality standpoint. Mack was very reserved. He was known as the tall tactician, would very rarely, if ever, yell and scream. And McGraw was, had a very nasty streak and a mean streak on the field, even though he could be very generous with former players off of the field. So you had two dominant personalities who were shrewd and who could evaluate personnel, and more often than not got the right people. And I think also both of them realized when a player's time had come, it was time to move on. They started looking for replacements, and this is long before farm systems. So, they just had to sort of keep their eyes, and they did have informal, they did have scouting on the staff, and each team, might have Mac. Mac actually had an informal network of people that would say, hey, there's a kid on the sandlots of some town in Texas. We need to take a look at him. They made mistakes, but they were right more than they were wrong, and they had just a fundamental understanding of the game. And one thing with McGraw that I didn't even realize until I got in my baseball research, for example, the Deadball Era is very much, and that's the year of this book, signified that a lot of times a run is manufactured in a somewhat boring way. Somebody walks, he gets bunted at second base, he goes to third on a ground ball to the second baseman and comes home on a fly ball. Or there may be a steal in there. But John McGraw almost instinctively never liked to bunt because he didn't want to give up an out. Why give up an out? There's 3 of them in an inning, and they're precious. Now, he did employ the hit and run a lot, where the guy at first base would take off, but he wasn't just going to have his player lay down a bunt to get thrown out at first base. These two men had a lot to do with the fact that these teams were in the World Series of this 2 decades multiple times.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. All right, let's talk about the Giants for a second, then we'll get to the A's. We had Bill Young on our episode 36. He's the author of the biography of John Tortoise Chief Myers, part of that team, right? And who, as battery mate Christy Mathewson, it was a pretty interesting story. And McGraw obviously relied on them and for a number of successful runs, not only in the World Series but during the course of the years, the seasons themselves. But I also get the sense too from that conversation that being in New York didn't necessarily hurt, right? Obviously, New York, in many respects, not only at that time and arguably in years and decades later too, was in many respects the sort of baseball center of the world, right? And
it was in the center of the world, and even outside of baseball. And you're right. And Philadelphia then ranked much higher in population at the beginning of the 20th century than it does now. It was a large city, and of course Chicago also. I just came back from the National Convention in Pittsburgh, and I presented a paper in the 1908 pennant race, which most people remember as the Giants and the Cubs, because they both were from big cities. And the Pirates only finished only one game out in that year, and yet Pittsburgh players are somewhat more overlooked. They're just not in the media center either. I mean, at that time that we're talking about, during most of this era, the New York City had, I'm going to guess, about 15 daily newspapers. And maybe Philadelphia had 7 or 8. I mean, there started to be consolidation, in the late teens, certainly in the early 20s. I mean, this is where you wanted to be. And you take a ball player that was a star with the St. Louis Browns, and he's just not going to be remembered as much as somebody who was a star on the Yankees. It's just a simple fact.
Yeah, if I remember our conversation with Bill Young correctly, I think Myers was part of like a Broadway skit thing with Mathewson. They literally went on tour and did shows. I mean, it's almost as a sidelight, I guess, but also certainly from a promotional perspective, not a bad thing to get people to go to the games and check them out.
Right, and these ball players were so larger than life that they didn't have to do very much or say very much on vaudeville, and people would want to see them. I mean, one of the stars of the Giants in this era was a fellow by the name of Mike Donlin, who married one of the most famous vaudeville comedic actresses in the nation. And he even quit one year in 1907, and he went on a vaudeville tour with his wife Mabel Hite. And these people were larger than life. They were really larger than life.
Now, by contrast, the A's, not only from Philadelphia being sort of a not necessarily as much of a media and or excitement and entertainment mecca as New York might be. Sorry for all of our Philly listeners, right. But I'm really interested. So the A's, obviously, as you sort of recount in a number of these years, I mean, we're very successful on an ongoing basis from 1905 onward. I mean, and literally from 1910 almost to the middle of the decade, right, was in the hunt. I mean, there was a period of time there. They were in 1910, 11, 13, and 14. I guess my question is sort of twofold. What was the magic of Connie Mack and the A's over that period of time? And then I guess the second part of that question, which we got to with David Jordan in our episode 21 a little bit. What happened in 1914 that kind of, shall we say, put an end to all of it in the years that followed, or at least for the near-term years that followed?
Well, again, Matt, as far as the first part of the question, he had some enormously talented ball players, and if you look at the performance of Home Run Baker in those World Series, he was just sensational on the big stage, so to speak, and Mack had some really, really talented players, and certainly Eddie Plank, who was the winningest southpaw until Warren Spahn came along and broke Plank's win record. I think Plank had 326 wins, southpaw pitcher. But the one difference between what the Philadelphia didn't have, and I'm not an expert on it, and David probably more than I do, is that the Philadelphia fans seemed not to turn out. Well, first of all, the market was much smaller than New York. But the Philadelphia, when they started winning year after year, 1911, they didn't make it in 1912 when the Red Sox and Smokey Joe Wood's incredible season, 13. You watch the Philadelphia attendance start to drop. And in 1914, they were still a great team. It's almost like the fans, became bored because they knew the A's were going to win the pennant, and Connie Mack made the decision that he was going to sell off his stars. Now, there was another story going on. There was an upstart league, and if you haven't had a feature on it yet, it's really worthwhile to talk about the Federal League, and the Federal League was a third major league that challenged the two established leagues, ironically just basically following the American League's 1901, 1902 playbook. But, of course, now the American League was established. They were part of the club and went to war. And so players were jumping and players were thinking about money, and Mack just decided it was time to let go and move forward. I think he thought that he could rebuild easier than he did because it took him a long, long time. He thought, again, that he could recruit and find great players on the sandlots, but more teams were now getting scouts, and Mack had a tremendous comeback in the late 20s, but he didn't do it from finding guys on sandlots. He got it from paying a lot of money for people like Lefty Grove and Mickey Cochran to minor league teams, paying them a lot of money to get these star players.
We had Dan Levitt on our show, episode 63, as a matter of fact, if you're listening at home, on the Federal League, and it's interesting because it does feel to me that and there are other reasons, right, for why the A's sort of ran their course and then went through the wilds for a while, sort of in more abundantness, if that's a word. Until the 20s when they did come back and there was sort of redemption there. But it's clear that even though the Federal League only lasted 2 seasons in 14 and 15, right, there was a a body blow, if you will, to the sport, and some rethinking of how talent and, how players got treated, and sort of the fact that there could be some other places where, there will be some more leverage for some of these players.
Sure, and I think our listeners should know that obviously there was no free agency back then, and I'm sure Dan is a good friend, explained it, very well. The players basically had a choice: play with their team or go do something outside of baseball, and there were very few of them that had opportunities, even though ball players weren't making a lot of money. If a star was making $5,000, Honus Wagner was making $10,000 starting in 1908. But if an average player was making $2,500, and I'm not the expert every year, but it was still many, many times more than one could make in some blue collar or even administrative job somewhere. And so they played the game. The Giants were probably a much more profitable team for many years, and even when they were on top. But with the A's, it was harder to get the fans to come out there when they were winning consistently and winning big.
Well, let's talk about a couple of other teams that sort of fit our little criteria here, and maybe 1914 is a good place to talk about, right? Because the A's, after having won 3 out of the last, they did very well up until through 1914, but they met a team that historically hadn't really sort of been in the mix, and it's been referred to, and we have not done an episode on this team yet, but it's certainly worth investigating, and that's the Boston Braves, right? Arguably known as the Miracle Braves of 1914.
Right, and one of the things that we see, and it's probably no different than nowadays, is that there are teams that climb their way to the top because they're hungry. And if you look in our book, in 1910, the Chicago Cubs had been in the World Series, every year except 1909 since 1906. And everybody thought they would take care of the A's, but the A's were hungry. And all of a sudden, when the A's won that series, and it wasn't even close, some of the newspapers were saying, long live the new king. Well, the A's reigned for a few years, and come 1914, they'd been in the World Series, and, there isn't that kind of hunger. It's hard to repeat when you've been on top for so many years. And the Braves are a spectacular story. Professor Charles Alexander, who does the foreword to this book, has written a book about George Stallings, really the mastermind. And again, as a manager, he was much more than manager. He assembled that team and led those Braves. And he was a hard rider, and he stayed on them almost like I picture him almost like a jockey on a horse, and cracking the whip. And they came back from last place in early July and never stopped. And they blew past the Giants and won the pennant easily, and then swept the powerful A's. And although unlike the A's, they were not, they were only a 1-year, pennant winner. They did come very close the next year and somewhat close in 1916, but they are a tremendous story. And of course, people don't realize and remember about the Boston Braves very much. And they are, there's certainly a wonderful story there. And Professor Alexander would be a great one to tell that story.
And I look forward to asking you for a connection to him, because we'd love to talk about his book and all that. So let's look at these 2 decades of the Deadball Era and the World Series in particular. Is there any theme that sort of pops up in all of this? There's something that you sort of didn't know or thought you knew and was maybe pushed aside or challenged or changed because of the investigation into the newspaper accounts and the photography that you and your co-writers came about?
Well, a few of the things really do. I mean, history does run in a circular track, as I'm so often reminded. There were certain things that happened then that can still happen now. And one thing is when a star ball player does not perform well. And, we start with 1903. The Deadball Era started in 1901, but there wasn't a series until 3. And Honus Wagner, who was the greatest player of that era, probably better than Tykov, hit only .222 that year. And the fans really were riding on him. And by the same token, on the flip side, we began to see players who were just nobodies, who all of a sudden in the World Series caught fire. And one of the best ones is George Rowe, R-O-H-E, in 1906. I mean, this guy was a .229 hitter, and he hit triples in 2 World Series games in 1906 to win the 2 games and help the White Sox upset the powerful Cubs. In 1918, there was a guy named George Whiteman. He hardly played. He had key hits to help the Red Sox win, and he was sensational in the field. You know, we have one of his quotes there, how happy he was, and he says, you know, even if I never play another game, now I know, you know, I've had my moment in the sun, so to speak. And guess what? George Whiteman did never play another game, certainly not another major league game. So you see that. You see, as you see today, hard luck pitchers that really played well. You know, I was just thinking, Christy Mathewson had an earned run average, and he played over 100 innings in World Series of this era. He had an earned run average of under 1. He had 10 decisions, and he went 5-5. I mean, Eddie Plank of the Athletics only went 2-5, and he had an earned run average not that much higher than 1.0. So you see some of these things happening that still happen to this day. There are some differences. One of the biggest differences is that in many cases fans were on the field, and the owners wanted to play, you know, to make more money, and there would literally be ropes put in the outfield, and in some cases there were even fans down the sidelines. I don't know in the World Series, but certainly in a lot of big regular season games in this era, the fans would be all around the field. In 1908, during the pennant race, you'd have fans standing behind the catcher. And obviously it would change the game. In 1903, they had to have ground rules, and that's where there were grounds rules, and they decided a ball that goes into the fans is a triple. And so obviously a routine fly ball could fall in for a triple. There were 25 triples in 1903. And it can really have an impact on the game, which you don't see now. And obviously you had stars that did perform really well, but that is a difference. The time of the games is obviously a huge difference. Games were just played much, much more quickly, and there was a game in 1908 that took an hour and 25 minutes, if you can imagine. You know, that certainly is different. The A's, when they won the championship in 1913, had 12 men on that they used in the World Series, including 3 pitchers. I mean, that's almost inconceivable nowadays. But like I said, sometimes a star player did not play well. Ty Cobb, in the 3 years that he was there, at least 2 of them especially, didn't play very well at all. But sometimes one player made a huge difference. And so some things were the same, some things were not the same, but there were dominant teams, and these 2 teams that, we don't have anymore, the Philadelphia Athletics and the New York Giants, were 2 of the most dominant ones.
How about the photography? Some of the photos in this book are pretty amazing, and you can kind of stare at them and sort of get lost and sort of hear some of the sounds and the music and maybe even breathe some of the air, and some of the how crystal clear some of these photos are, and frankly, they reveal quite a bit, right? And to our point earlier, right? I mean, there are no sounds, there are no radio broadcasts, there's certainly no television, there's just writing, but also these photographs, which, to your point, is some of which have never really been seen, sort of in modern circulation. What did you how did you cull the photography into this book? Because I got to think there were some amazing shots there that didn't even make the cut.
Well, yeah, there were. One of the really neat things that this book, the World Series and the Deadball Era, originally was going to have about 180 photos. And when I was working with a publisher, and I submitted the different photos, and a lot of them I worked with in terms of cropping them, to make the images, that you could focus. I submitted maybe 7 or 8 extra ones. I just pushed in there and I said they're optional ones. And of course, we tried to locate them close to the text so they'd be easily to be related. And the publisher ended up taking all those extra ones. So we end up with 250 photos. There's one private collector in particular. His name is Dennis Goldstein. He's from Southern Oregon. And the largest group of photographs came from him. And in all my writing, I've always wanted, even in a biography that I've written, I want the photos to be as special as the text. And when people see this, and it's certainly the case in this book, and they're really equals, the writing and the photos are the same in terms of being equals. So ideally, I would have liked to say to you all 250 pictures were taken in the World Series. They were not. And they're just, there has been a lot that's been lost over the years. The other thing is that action shots were pretty hard to come by, because even when the photographers were on the field and they'd be, near the coacher's box on first base or third base, and I don't know if it was just a lack of depth of field, but a lot of times the action photo would just be a cloud of dust. You wouldn't see very much. So what I ended up selecting was taking some photos. If I was going to have a Christy Mathewson photo and it wasn't from the series, and we do have some that are from, it would be a unique photo. It wouldn't be like a real common photo that people say, oh, I've seen that before. George Rowe, for example, the book has a portrait of George Rowe that was taken, I think, early in the 1907 season. This was the star of the 1906 World Series. Virtually nobody has seen a picture of George Rowe before. So in many cases, I tried to find, if it wasn't in the World Series, then it was, close to that era and a seldom seen, photograph. And they really, they work, like you said, there's a synergy between the photos and the writing. And then, you can imagine the cheering. If it's funny, you had mentioned a quote. If we have a moment, I'd love to read you one I just happen to have here, because I turned to 1911, if I might.
Please go right ahead.
So the 1911 World Series, as I think we talked about, was when Home Run Baker basically shocked the baseball world, and I'm just taking a look here. And so when he hit a home run off of Christy Mathewson, and this came from the Philadelphia Ledger, the vast throng literally went mad for the nonce. Facile pen is entirely inadequate to fittingly describe the wild, barbaric scene that was enacted in all parts of the huge baseball arena. All was a babel of confusion. It seemed as though the human reason had been dethroned. Great was the hit, cyclonic was the ovation. It will live in baseball history as long as the national game survives. Well, many of our listeners, may not remember that home run, and actually that may have been his home run off of Rube Marquardt, another star of the Giants. And Home Run Baker then came back the very next day, and he hit one off of Mathewson, which so it was just so dramatic. And again, the writing is probably accurate, but it's very florid. You don't normally talk about barbaric scenes or a babble of confusion or cyclonic ovation, but those were the words that the writers, used.
All right, two things before we sort of round home here, so to speak, or round third as we slide into home.
Right.
Thank you. I got to get my analogies correct here. I thought 1904, interesting that you even have a chapter devoted to the series that actually wasn't a series.
Yeah, one of the things the National League was the established league, and in the first year of the series when rules weren't really formalized, the American League with the Boston Americans basically upset the Pittsburgh Pirates. And in 1904, the Giants did not want to play the World Series. And at the time, it looked like the New York Americans, which are now the Yankees, were going to win in the American League. And McGraw and then the owner of the Giants really didn't want to, even suggest that the American League team was equal with them. And then the Boston Americans did win on the last day of the season, and the Giants refused to win, and we refused to play. And the 1904 chapter, I think, is an important one because McGraw and the Giants were really savagely attacked in the New York press for not giving the fans and the players an opportunity to see them play. And then the very next year, the Giants were back in the series, and then from 1905 on, they started playing the series. There's a photograph in there that I don't think is probably one of the rarest photos of all time in the book, and it shows a bunch of Boston fans. They had beaten New York American League team on the last day of the season. They knew they couldn't play the World Series. The Giants weren't going to play them. They're marching down Broadway with banners of protest that, McGraw and the Giants are cowards, for not playing them. So the Giants took quite a beating there in even their own local press.
And the last thing that stands out to me is in the era that that the book focuses on, where the World Series played between 1903 and 1919. I'm struck by the fact that all of the teams, save for 1904, but even if they were to have played in 1904, all the teams from that era in the World Series either still exist today continuously or exist in other cities, meaning no teams that are no longer with us, dead and buried. They're all teams that are still either foundationally or successfully or successively still around in the sport of baseball today. It's a pretty interesting testament. Is that unique, or am I just making something out of nothing there? I think it's pretty.
Well, so, of course, some of them were dramatically, relocated more than once. When the Athletics, went to Kansas City, and now they're in Oakland. So certainly, all of these teams stayed in their home cities until the early 1950s. So, teams, I guess I would a little bit look at that a little bit more differently, because somebody's going to want to have a team, and if there's a city that's on the rise or a city that's on the fall, then another city's going to grab it. Certainly in the beginning of the century, Detroit was a very small team, and a lot of people even talked that they were in the World Series for 3 years. The Tigers, early in this book, thought that Detroit was going to lose. It just wasn't a major league city. Well, guess what? The automobile came along, and Detroit, became a fabulously wealthy and populated city. When I was in Detroit last year, I was reminded again, I think they have the fourth most valuable art museum in terms of its holdings after New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Detroit had so much money then. St. Louis at the beginning of the 20th century had two teams, no problem. But when when boats got replaced by railroads, all of a sudden St. Louis started, declining as a population center. So cities do come and go, and rise and fall. But then there's the new city. We forget when the Boston Braves were lost. But they went to Milwaukee, and Milwaukee became the hot city until it wasn't hot anymore. And then the Braves move again. They're in Atlanta. So there is a up and down cycle there of some sort.
Well, though, okay, again, if you consider yourself a Boston Red Sox fan or a fan of the Oakland A's, the San Francisco Giants, the Atlanta Braves, or the LA Dodgers, right? These are all teams that had World Series realities during the Deadball Era, and that's what this book is about. It's really, I think it's fascinating. I mean, the way it's laid out in terms of the stories, how it's written, sort of in newspaper accounts, and sort of overlaid with some really interesting photography that seems quite rare to me, and I suspect will. It's you can stare at it and get some real insight into some of those photos, and the writings the writing just makes
right, and I think the title and the cover speak for themselves. The World Series in the Deadball Era is pretty straightforward, and we have a picture of the dugout of the 1903 Pittsburgh Pirates. Included in that dugout is Honus Wagner, still one of the greatest players of all time, but yet it really isn't a dugout. If you look at it, it's a little shack, but that was the World Series dugout of the National League champions. And the Boston Americans dugout looked exactly the same, and their pictures inside the book also.
All right, Steve, here's your chance to promote. Go ahead. Give us the name of the book, the author, the publisher, and all that kind of good stuff.
Sure. I do want to mention the fact that the book was generated by SABR's Deadball Era Committee. That's one of the SABR committees. We literally have a committee that is passionate about this era. So different members of the committee stepped forward and said, hey, I'm going to do 1917, and then went to the different newspapers, maybe had to ask other SABR members in other cities, send me some information, and obviously we had to pare down the writing. There are ellipses in here, we don't go on, and then I tried to pull it together. I was particularly involved with perhaps a couple of the series that are in here. So it simply is the World Series of the Deadball Era, and it was it's a product of SABR, the research of SABR's Deadball Era Committee, what we call the DEC, Deadball Era Committee, and it's published by a wonderful small quality press called St. Johann Press, and it's available through St. Johann or certainly through Amazon. And it's really a unique kind of a book, and it happens. It's not available as an ebook, which I'm okay with, because the pictures really lends itself to being sort of it is a book. It's on real paper and with 250 images and all these writers. And again, most of the photographers are anonymous, and they probably don't deserve to be anonymous. I suppose one could undertake trying to find their names. There are some, Charles Conlon being the most famous. We have a number of his pictures in here. But by and large, a lot of this writing and a lot of these photographs, we'll never know who really generated it. But they really painted some masterpieces back in this era. So.
Well, it's partially why we do these shows, because we do want to sort of go back and sort of touch on things that are no longer with us. Obviously, the teams and the leagues themselves, but obviously the some of the stories and the rationale behind them. And I think you've certainly captured that with this book and some dusty, I guess, memories of what the Deadball Era World Series looked like and sounded like. And even though we didn't have any audio or video to accompany us in those journeys.
Right. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to, so to speak, spread the word, because ultimately, and it's a phrase that was used as the title of a book, trying to honor the men in the glory of their times. And that's certainly the case, this book. And like I said, some were stars for a long time, and others were just stars for a moment. They had their moment in the sun just in the World Series, and never again, never before, never after.
As always, I learned something. And in this particular conversation, I must tell you that, old-time baseball per se, not necessarily my thing. I tend to sort of gravitate to more of the modern things and lots more pictures and video and audio. But, again, we delve into these conversations because we're interested in teams and leagues that are not around anymore. And again, if you consider yourself a fan of the Boston Red Sox, the Oakland A's, the San Francisco Giants, the Atlanta Braves, the LA Dodgers, these are teams that go way back into the beginnings of the history of baseball, and teams known then as, in order, the Boston Americans, the Philadelphia Athletics, the New York Giants, the Boston Braves, and of course the Brooklyn Dodgers. These are all teams that have heritage that live on today. And this book is really interesting. It's called The World Series in the Deadball Era. And the photography in here is pretty amazing, because these are photos that are either never been released before or have never really been in circulation until recently. Married with some just amazing writing from newspapers at the time. And again, as we talked about in our conversation, these writings were not necessarily sort of rat-tat-tat, encapsulations of the actual games themselves, but these were really well written stories, right, from authors that wound up going into bigger and better things than simply just writing about sports. I mean, Ring Lardner and Grantland Rice and Damon Runyon, and I mean these are names of literary times from that era that got their start or continued in writing about baseball and the stories and the watercolor sort of flowery writing about just how dramatic and interesting these games were. It's amazing, and juxtaposed with the photography, it's a pretty interesting book. And again, it's called The World Series in the Deadball Era: A History in the Words and Pictures. Thank you to the writers and photographers of that era. The author and editor is Steve Steinberg, and that is published by St. Johann Press. You can find a link to a copy of the book, and you can buy it through our link there for Amazon at our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up a little episode here, and you'll be whisked away to a link that will allow you to purchase that book and give us a little bit of love in the process. And I also recommend Steve's website as well. It's stevesteinberg.net, and Steinberg is spelled Steinberg, stevesteinberg.net. You'll find out more about this book, his biography of the 1920s pitcher Urban Shocker, who pitched for the Browns and of St. Louis and the New York Yankees, and a whole bunch of other stuff that he's involved with Sabre. And I highly encourage you to check that out early and often. Of course, please, our website, you got to go back and bookmark that, of course, and you haven't done so, shame on you. That's goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you'll find all of our social links and all of the past episodes, and where you can follow us on social media. And of course, you want some shortcuts there, of course. Please go to Twitter. You'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. And you also find us on Facebook. There's a page devoted to us there as well. Our thanks, as always, to our friends at Podfly Productions, Eric Begay, Corey Coates, David Gregerson, of course, the inimitable Dr. Jerry Payne, who puts all these pieces together painstakingly, get it, every week. And you can find out more about him and the company at podfly.net. We can't do it without them, and we appreciate it. All right, thanks. I'm done. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week. And until then, take care, everybody.